When I was capturing footage for the 2 lines opening in Bellevue, I decided to grab food at this Chick-fil-A. Unfortunately, the restaurant did not have anywhere to sit because it primarily serves people by drive-thru. There is a walk-up window, but people who walk up must either awkwardly sit down and eat food near the order window, or walk somewhere in the hopes they can find a place to sit. Meanwhile, people who came by car could simply eat in their vehicle. On the surface, it is rather unfair that people who walk don't get a place to sit because the restaurant chose to prioritize people who arrived by car. But at least there was a walk-up window. Some drive-thru only restaurants don't even have that much. I wanted to make this video because it's not just a fairness issue. Drive-thrus actively harm walkable places by encouraging more car use and making places less comfortable for pedestrians. To be clear, I don't want to make it sound like the drive-thru itself is the enemy here. The way I see it, this drive-thru is a reflection of Bellevue's car-centric design. Most people passing through are going to be in a car, so of course Chick-fil-A would prioritize people in cars over anybody else. Fast food and drive-thrus are intertwined with this country's love for the automobile. Adam Chandler, author of Drive-Thru Dreams, describes the history that led to the popularization of drive-thrus. It started with a drive-in, where people would drive up to the restaurant and have their food delivered by a car hop so they could eat without leaving their vehicle. These restaurants were mostly phased out in favor of a more streamlined process where people drive up to a window called the drive-thru. The 90s were prepped with awe-striking innovations like drive-thru banks and drive-thru dry cleaners and drive-thru photo processing centers. Fledgling drive-thru businesses came to run the commercial gamut from the practical to the brilliant and perhaps ill-conceived to the downright spiritual. In a previous video, I mentioned drive-thru banks, which was quite a surprise to international audiences. Do note, it's not quite a drive-thru bank, it's more like an ATM that you can drive up to, but there may also be an additional lane with a bank teller you can interact with. For the sake of simplicity, I am going to focus on drive-thru restaurants, which is commonly what people associate with drive-thrus. The most enduring and widely embraced of these businesses were drive-thru restaurants. By the late 1960s, drive-in restaurants had mostly fallen out of favor. Wendy's founder Dave Thomas understood that the light at the end of the competitive tunnel was a headlight. Thomas found success with a speedy drive-thru window. Bigger franchisors such as Burger King and Kentucky Fried Chicken quickly followed suit on their own. The drive-thru window, which went mainstream as a bonus amenity in the 1970s, eventually morphed into a necessity for the increasingly frantic way of life in which dining out became a deed born of circumstance more than just luxury. The reason drive-thrus are so popular is because they combine the quick service of fast food with the convenience of never having to leave your vehicle. A survey of 2,000 adults conducted by Dutch Brothers found 47% of consumers would avoid going to a store that does not have a drive-thru. Getting out of a car could be disruptive, especially for people who have pets or small children, so the drive-thru is a necessary convenience. Plus, people who are commuting probably don't want to slow down their trip by getting out of their car. Suburban office parks and power centers may not have food options within walking distance, so people working at these kinds of places would probably feel more inclined to go through the drive-thru on a lunch break. Fast food restaurants also tend to prioritize the drive-thru, even going as far to time their workers for how quickly they can process orders. They believe it is crucial for their business because a fast-moving drive-thru makes the restaurant more attractive for people looking for a quick bite to eat. Bob Vergadis, Chief Visionary Officer at PointOfSale.Cloud, told the Food Institute, drive-thrus create an easy way to see how long the line is and how fast it is moving before deciding which restaurant to choose. They are a visual indicator of how long it will take for guests to receive orders. 68% of people surveyed by Dutch Brothers admitted that they judge the quality of store by their drive-thru. This is partly why restaurants obscure the drive-thru lane. They place it behind the building and place barriers or plants so people cannot see how many cars are ahead of them, and the store doesn't lose any potential customers who would be less inclined of pulling into a restaurant with a busy drive-thru. However, speed of service isn't the only factor in making customers happy. According to QSR Magazine, Chick-fil-A generally has the longest wait times than other popular fast food restaurants, but customers don't feel a long wait time because of a few tricks. Typically, customers must order through a speaker box and wait to get to the window before getting the food. At Chick-fil-A, the lane is split into two, and orders are taken by people who have tablets. They may also bring food out to waiting vehicles, so it always feels faster to order from Chick-fil-A because there is always something happening to make it seem like you will place or receive your order soon. They also score higher than other restaurants in terms of order accuracy. This allows Chick-fil-A to routinely rank higher than other fast food restaurants in terms of customer satisfaction. So far, it sounds pretty great. You get your food in a timely manner without an intrusive deviation from the car trip. However, the drive-thru can be as much of a convenience as a nuisance. Since some of the parking spots may be blocked by the drive-thru line, drivers may feel less inclined to park in them, making them effectively useless. Drive-thru lines may also spill onto surrounding streets, slowing down and blocking other cars. It doesn't seem like a good idea to have drivers stop in the middle of the road as they wait for a drive-thru line. Meanwhile, in a normal city where people actually walk to places, long lines to restaurants isn't much of a big deal. For example, on May 27th, the Seattle-based Little Woody's had a special event, a free burger day. As one would expect with an event like this, there was a fairly long line out the door of each restaurant. At peak times, I counted the line was about 30 people long. If a 30-person line of the same length was placed into cars with 1 or 2 people each, it would have stretched much further, creating all sorts of traffic headaches near each store, parking lot, and intersection. This isn't a completely unreasonable scenario either. Cars are spatially inefficient, and when a lot of people are trying to arrive at one spot by car, it can induce quite a traffic nightmare. We see a much more extreme example of this whenever a fast food restaurant opens in a new kind of area and everyone decides to flock to their cars just to try it. These are aerial shots of Idaho's first In-N-Out restaurant, which generated a massive line of cars. It's going to be fun seeing the story repeat itself when In-N-Out opens its first location in a suburb north of Vancouver. That's the Washington, Vancouver, not the cool one. It's such a strange concept to me. I like In-N-Out. I think it's better than Dick's Drive-In in a lot of ways. But I can't imagine any fast food restaurant is good enough to spend more than 30 minutes waiting in line. But let's go a little further with this. Let's imagine Little Woody's was a typical fast food restaurant in car-infested suburbia. Since I feel like picking on Renton, I will use this suburb as the example of what a suburban Little Woody's may look like. Hopefully people would be okay with me calling Renton a suburb. I erroneously used suburb to describe parts of Seattle that wasn't the downtown in my cafes and corner stores video, so this should be more in line with an actual Seattle suburb. The restaurant would have to comply with minimum parking requirements and regulations for stacking. Renton requires 5 stacking spaces per window, so the special drive-thru lane that catches all the cars would have to be big enough to hold 5 vehicles. Additionally, the restaurant would also require 1 space per 75 square feet of dining area. Giving the dining area 1,000 square feet of floor space, it would need 13 parking stalls. So now the restaurant is dwarfed by the size of the parking lot. But it's still missing something. Oh yeah, it needs that green space and parking lot trees. Now it is a true suburban Little Woody's. I know the drawing looks a little silly, and part of it is because I'm not an artist, but when looking at the actual drive-thrus around Renton, it doesn't seem way off base. The land use makes the area feel empty compared to urban fast food restaurants. The Little Woody's on Pine Street is near a cheese room and an upcoming Voodoo Donuts in the Pink Building. This used to be a Land's Hand-Pulled Noodles and a faux restaurant. Not gonna lie, it's a bit of a downgrade. But at least there's always something. It's still better than a store being surrounded by parking lots, a drive-thru lane, and pointless green space. The baseline for these parking and stacking requirements comes from 2 manuals that were published by the Institute of Transportation Engineers. Trip generation estimates the number of vehicle trips generated by different land use, and parking generation estimates the parking demand based on various land uses. By aggregating data from a variety of surveys, the ITE can come up with a rough estimate of how many trips will be generated and how much parking will be needed. These estimates come from a genuine concern regarding how new developments will affect traffic and whether there will be enough parking. However, the methodology to aggregate this data and the response to these concerns are often misguided. This practice is responsible for the abysmal land use found throughout suburbia. Rarely will restaurants actually need the amount of parking that is supplied. When taking a moment to really look at the surveys, this process becomes all the more baffling. Here's an example of a survey of a fast food restaurant with a drive-thru window. This land use is said to generate an average of 632.125 trips, but the range is between 280 daily trips and 1,359. It is an odd decision to include such a precise average with such a wide range. It seems as though including the median number of trips would have been more appropriate. Another thing worth noticing is this trend line and the accompanied R-square value of 0.069. The R-squared value is basically a measure of how correlated the variables are. An R-squared value of 0.069 is basically saying the gross floor area has almost nothing to do with trip generation. Despite this, gross floor area dictates an awful lot of parking requirements and our assumptions of trip generation. Parking generation also contains the same issues. Low R-squared value, which means gross floor area doesn't have much to do with parking. A range of parking rates that is large enough to wonder why they bothered to include the average rate and didn't specify the median rate. A scatter plot with a trend line that doesn't seem to match the actual trend. This misguided process sets the baseline for how much parking there must be, how big the stacking area shall be, and how much land is ultimately wasted in the event that this is actually how much parking is needed. Ironically, building for ample parking only inflates trip generation and parking demand. In suburbia, each building is separated by asphalt parking lots, which makes them feel further away from each other. Fast food restaurants also adds access points along the roadway so drivers can easily pull into the parking lot or the drive-thru lane. This adds more points of contention between pedestrians and other drivers. People on foot especially must be careful because drivers in more car-centric locations aren't as mindful of pedestrians as drivers in urban environments. They'll block sidewalks, block crosswalks, turn without looking for anyone, and so on. I can't entirely blame them either. When the adjacent road has multiple lanes of fast-moving traffic, they must pull forward to clearly see an opening to get back on the road. Places with a high concentration of drive-thrus are more dangerous for pedestrians. A study from the Florida Department of Transportation found fast food restaurants had a positive correlation with pedestrian crashes. Every fast food restaurant per square mile results in an average increase of 0.069 pedestrian crashes in 4 years. Between it being a long, uncomfortable, and hostile walk, and it generally being easier to get around by car, more people opt to drive, which inflates car trips and feeds into a cycle where more parking is necessary and more car trips must be accounted for when building new developments. These drive-thrus aren't good for air quality either. While people are waiting in line, their cars are idling, which makes the surrounding area a hotspot for air pollution. Drive-thru employees are regularly exposed to nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter from car emissions. Studies have found that these pollutants can accumulate in other people's cars as well. The particulate matter can enter people's bloodstreams and make pre-existing conditions such as asthma and cardiovascular disease worse. Drive-thrus also lead to there being more littering. When people order to go, the food comes with extra packaging and disposable items. And much like how some people don't return their shopping carts properly, some people don't throw away their trash correctly. It accumulates, leading to there being more messier places. Despite these drawbacks, it seems that fast food restaurants are doubling down on drive-thrus. Probably the craziest one seen recently is Taco Bell Defy. This is a massive structure where the drive-thru lanes travel underneath the building and deliver food through a vertical lift. This was designed to increase speed and throughput by adding more lanes. When considering the negative externalities of drive-thrus, something like Taco Bell Defy should absolutely not be built somewhere that is trying to embrace being a walkable urban environment. This is why it is probably for the best that, in 2019, Minneapolis banned the construction of new drive-thru facilities, citing concerns of pedestrian safety, litter, and emissions. A change like this is always going to be met with some resistance. People in car-centric areas are going to be against any change that makes life less convenient for people traveling by car because that is all they've grown accustomed to. At the same time, when a place embraces adequate alternatives to driving, the drive-thru is not something that will be missed. Perhaps a good start would be a ban on drive-thrus in places that are envisioned to be dense walkable areas near current or future transit stations. Probably the most baffling drive-thru in Seattle is this combination KFC and Taco Bell in one of the most densely populated neighborhoods. This is exactly the kind of spot that should not be home to a drive-thru. It should be a mixed-use development with a massive number of housing units on the upper levels and restaurants on the bottom floor. And this can be done without getting rid of the fast food restaurants. For example, there used to be a McDonald's on the corner of this First Hill neighborhood, and it was bulldozed and replaced with a 17-story tall apartment building. Back in January, it was announced that Five Guys was opening a location at this spot. So soon, people can go to First Hill to spend $25 on a decent cheeseburger, a soda, and more fries than they bargained for. People may miss the restaurant itself, but not necessarily the car trips that were generated by the drive-thru. As for more suburban areas, it is important to stop feeding into the cycle of overestimating parking demand and building massive parking lots based on those estimates. Rather than responding to anticipated trip generation and parking demand by supplying ample parking lots, urban planners should prioritize building a network that supports adequate alternatives to driving. If the number of anticipated trips are expected to overwhelm the roadways and parking lots, then the solution should be to absorb those expected trips into more spatially efficient alternatives. Looking at Renton, it's honestly pretty disgraceful. This should not be a car-dependent suburb that wastes all this space on parking lots, box stores, and drive-thrus. There should be a spur coming off the 1 line with a junction station at the commuter rail station, and then it follows South Grady Way, allowing all this to be developed into a walkable transit-centric neighborhood. Of course, this would be a massive undertaking, so in the meantime, it may be worthwhile to follow the footsteps of Portland, which added a rule to prevent drive-thru restaurants from turning away people who arrive by foot or by bike. The addition of a new fast food restaurant should not burden roadways and parking lots. And when trips are being absorbed into alternative means, a busy fast food restaurant stops looking like a hectic drive-thru and starts looking more like a simple line of people.